All right, welcome. So today we have my interpreting the 60s class, as well as Professor Richard's honors seminar. So happy today we have Michael Koncewicz. I'm sorry, I'm like terrible. I can barely pronounce my own name. Anyway, this is, I just want to put your book up here. This is Michael Koncewicz. He's taught here in the history department. He's the head of NYU's Temperament Library, which is an amazing archival collection of Cold War and other resources. This is, so he works there. Okay, I put that, yes, okay, he works at the library, I'm sorry. Anyway, this is his new book. It's not for sale today, but you can buy it on Amazon. And it's a wonderful book, and I'm going to read to you what Kirkus said about his book. In his debut book, professional archivist and Richard Nixon scholar mines vast research material to illuminate Nixon's tenure from a fresh angle. His determination to violate laws for political advantage and the appointees who refused to obey. A scholarly work in all the right ways and excruciatingly timely. So this is a very exciting book to discuss today in the context of recent political events, and I hope you'll touch on those. Thank you so much for joining us. It's so nice to have you, and hopefully you'll be teaching here next semester or in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Horowitz. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, St. Francis, for having me here. Is that better? Can everyone hear me? All right, I'll try to stay in front of the mic as much as possible. Feel free to nudge me in the right direction if you need to. So yes, my book is called They Said No to Nixon, Republicans Who Stood Up to the President's Abuse of Power. This is a project that started as a dissertation while I was a graduate student. Back in 2010, 2011, and while I was a graduate student, I also worked at a place called the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum on the National Archives side. I can talk more about that later if you care to learn about that, but that's where I developed this interest in studying the stories of Republicans who stood up to Nixon's abuses of power. It was way before Donald Trump's presidential campaign, so that did not spur this topic, although events in the last few years have made this topic particularly more relevant as we're trying to figure out, what is the role of civil servants within an administration that's under investigation for potential crimes. I want to start off first with a conversation that took place in August of 1972. This is a conversation that actually opens my book. It's the very first paragraph of the introduction. And I feel like it encapsulates kind of the overall theme of this book. Just a little bit of context before I play this conversation. This is a conversation with Richard Nixon, John Ehrlichman, his top domestic advisor, and H.R. Haldeman, his chief of staff, is also in the room. What they're talking about in August of 1972, this takes place actually roughly about 6 weeks after the infamous Watergate break-in. What they're talking about here is ways to punish their political enemies, ways to actually use the IRS to audit their political opponents. And at the top of their list that summer, there's hundreds of people that they want to go after that summer, but at the top of their list is Larry O'Brien. Larry O'Brien was the then head of the DNC, Democratic National Committee, whose office was actually broken into that June. Now remember, in August of 1972, Watergate is not a huge national story like it became in 1973. So when Richard Nixon is talking to his advisors, you need to take that, you need to place that in the back of your minds, and that really shapes the conversation that happens here. So I'm just going to play about 2 minutes of this conversation, and then I'll further explain what's going on.
What is being done? Who is doing this full time? Who's running the IRS? Who's running over the Justice Department? So what I meant is, with all the agencies of government, what in the name of God are we doing about the government treaties? I think short answer answer your question, nothing. And, we are. No question. And it's never happened that way before. I can give you Johnson screwed everybody, Ken had. And when we were out in 52, the Truman people were kicking the hell out of me. In 60, they kicked the hell out of me. In 1960, the bureaucracy leached up on my visit with Khrushchev. The revising our bureaucracy. That's part of the problem is the bureaucracy. Part of the problem is our own goddamn fault. There must be something that we can do. I don't disagree. Where's the we see around we can listen to anybody to do this kind of work. I think the trouble is we got too many nice guys around. We just want to do the right thing. But very interesting. Well, we trying to do it and fail really is that we got a guy who's a perfect fashion. He's a loyalist. He's a fanatic loyalist in the IRS. And he's our guy. One Treasury Secretary after another, starting with Kennedy, Connelly, now Schultz, that said, oh, geez, can't you get this guy out of there? Can't you just take him out of this, making all kinds of trouble for us? He's too partisan. He's too loyal. One thing about Schultz is that Schultz is not long for this life. Because he's not being political. I don't care how nice the Elliot is, I don't care how good the competency is. We can't have this bullshit. Well, the interesting thing is that it's political and guys Connelly played the same too. I know, Connelly was sitting on top of the bureaucracy. Well, Connelly knew the bureaucracy on one side, and then the other Connelly wouldn't play it. And he played it off as the IRS commissioner and all that. That was this we had to live on.
All right, sorry, I let that go on for a little bit.
Is the piercing stop?
Yes. So, just a few notes. Seems like this isn't on anymore. The mic's not on.
Oh, okay, maybe that's what was causing the piercing.
I think this one's. Hello?
Yes. Oh, there's the piercing.
I'll try to talk as loud as possible.
Yeah, just try to talk.
All right. There we go. All right, so just a few notes. The title of the introduction is Too Many Nice Guys. Because let's go back to that quote. I think the trouble is that we've got too many nice guys around here who just want to do the right thing. So what is Nixon talking about here? Well, he's talking about people who are standing in the way of his efforts to create a more authoritarian government, to use the IRS for purely political purposes. He feels that the IRS harassed him when he was a vice president in the 1950s, when he was a gubernatorial candidate in California in 1962. We can address the details of those accusations later on, but he wants tough guys. He wants tough guys to go after him. He's sick of the nice guys in his administration who do not want to use government for purely political purposes. And that's incredibly significant. You may say he's being a little facetious here, but you don't hear any laughter, okay? It's a very serious statement. And this conversation really encapsulates This conversation really encapsulates the division within the administration between those who are not interested in having a purely political operation and Nixon's own cutthroat form of politics and his own form of governance. That's really on display in this conversation from August of 1972. Now, the figure that he brings up, Schultz, does anyone know who he's referring to? George Schultz, very good. George Schultz was then the Secretary of Treasury, served in a few other cabinet positions. We may address that later on if we have time. But in the summer of 1972, he is Secretary of the Treasury. And he is arguing with Nixon's top advisors because he does not want to support their plan to audit political enemies. And he's also very hesitant to call in Larry O'Brien for a full-scale audit of his taxes. All right? In the summer of 1972, Nixon really wants to harass Larry O'Brien to dig up dirt on his own personal finances. Now, with that one particular case, George Schultz eventually caves. They agree to bring in Larry O'Brien. They actually end up finding out that he's owed a refund. They actually overpaid on his taxes. That, of course, infuriates Nixon. Nixon is enraged. He's convinced that the IRS is out to get him. The very next month, not sure where that noise is coming from. Maybe someone's bugging the room. But the very next month, after Schultz begrudgingly caved on the order to bring in Larry O'Brien, a very, very political act, he stands up to the administration. And there were signs that he was going to do this earlier that summer, and that's why Nixon is so pissed off at George Shultz. But together with the then commissioner of the IRS, Johnny Walters, he's the gentleman in the right photo, on the left, that's him being sworn in 1971, the two of them refuse together to audit political enemies. So what happens in September of 1972 is that John Dean, based on orders coming from the very top, from Richard Nixon and his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, meets with Johnny Walters and gives him a list. That list is the infamous White House enemies list. Hundreds and hundreds of Democratic donors, anti-war activists. This list includes even some prominent Hollywood celebrities who are critical of Richard Nixon, like Paul Newman, journalists. Hundreds and hundreds of Nixon's enemies are on this list. And John Dean wants Johnny Walters to use this list to carry out full-scale audits. They're doing this in September 1972 when most of the country is not paying attention to Watergate. They're doing this when pretty much everyone's predicting a landslide where Richard Nixon's going to defeat the anti-war Democrat George McGovern, it's a senator from South Dakota. And they're doing this thinking that they're going to have a full second term where they can fully control, the levers of government. Fortunately for the country, Johnny Walters says no. He refuses to carry out this order. He takes the list and he places it in a vault. And he meets with his boss, George Shultz, talks about the order, and Shultz fully backs him up on their plan to block the enemies list project. This is actually a clip of George Shultz in 2007 talking about why he resisted this order.
I turned off all the audio, but I think we've resolved the latest.
Is this it?
And then I turned off the
Okay. This will be the last.
I think it might be a hearing aid, if anyone has a hearing aid.
Okay. Well, here's the clip. I'll just do a Nixon impression for the rest of the presentation.
Johnny Walters came to me and said, John Dean, the President's counsel, has just brought me a list of, I think, 50 names of people and wants a full field investigation of them. That's a very unpleasant thing to have happen to you. What should I do? And I said, don't do it. And he said, well, what shall I tell John Dean when he asked me how it's going? I said, tell him that you report to me. If he has a problem, he's got a problem with me. So they never brought it up with me, although on the tapes there's a discussion between the president and John Dean about who I think I am holding this up. But it was an improper use of the IRS, and I wouldn't do it. When it came to anything of that kind where you're using the power of government, I think, and I held then and I stuck to it, that you've got to do it properly. And I was being asked to do something improper and I wouldn't do it. And I think things like that had been done before. And so maybe the president thought he was just doing what others have done, but anyway, not with me.
That's a very, very important clip from a very important oral history that George Shultz did for the Richard Nixon Library back in 2007. So George Shultz, remember, he is a Nixon appointee. He's a Republican. This is not some Democrat within the Nixon administration, someone that despises Nixon. This is someone who's been fairly loyal to Nixon up until this point, but thought that this was crossing the line in terms of what was an appropriate step to take for a cabinet member working for Richard Nixon. And so what my book does is it highlights these stories, figures like George Shultz, figures like Elliot Richardson, who you see right here, he's in the middle, that's his swearing-in ceremony when he became Attorney General of the United States in May of 1973. These prominent cabinet-level officials who determined that Nixon and his attempt to abuse powers, his power grab, was just out of line. and they, in their own ways, tried to resist Nixon's worst instincts. In a time where we're trying to wonder what people are doing behind the scenes in the Trump administration, and we have stories of anonymous op-eds and leaked reports about people expressing concerns about what are Donald Trump tweets any given day. It's I think important to contrast those stories with these, or substantive acts of resistance, where people are actually, in some cases, laying their careers on the line in order to rein in the worst instincts of the Nixon presidency. So what happens with Johnny Walters and George Shultz? I go into the details in the book, of course, but what happens is they block the plan, and it's why most of Nixon's enemies are not audited. Next to the Watergate break-in, I think the American public is at least vaguely aware that Nixon had an enemies list. And because we're cynical about government, there's this assumption that that list was used and that people were harassed. Now, there were certain individuals who were. There were some loyal Nixon Republicans in the IRS who kind of got around the system and were able to carry out, but those cases were few and far between. This large-scale enemies list project was blocked by George Shultz and Johnny Walters. And that's a story that I feel has not been told enough. And so I argue that I'm telling this story for the first time and feature a lot of details, using archival evidence, using the tapes. I listened to about 200 to 300 hours of Nixon White House tapes for this project. And so I think these stories, like I said, complicate the traditional Watergate narrative and offers up some new insight in terms of what we should expect from our civil servants today in 2018. The most famous figure who resisted Richard Nixon is probably the one who best represents the group of guys who did this. I refer to them as good government Republicans. Richard Nixon would often call them establishment Republicans, people who hung out with the wrong circles, hung out with the quote-unquote liberal establishment in the early 1970s, when there actually was a liberal establishment with real influence in Washington, D.C. And Elliot Richardson, who you see right there, is representative of this crowd. I'll talk more about them in a little bit. So who are these Republicans who stood up to Nixon? Most were moderates. Some could even be described as liberals in 2018, but some were conservatives. People like George Shultz and Johnny Walters came from fairly conservative backgrounds, especially Johnny Walters. Johnny Walters, the IRS commissioner who said no, perhaps in an even stronger way than George Shultz, was from South Carolina. And so you didn't have to be a moderate in order to resist Nixon, but what you had to do was accept kind of the post-war New Deal order, which was mostly run by liberals, but was mostly run by this idea that there was a nonpartisan way to run the federal government. So someone like Johnny Walters from South Carolina, from a fairly conservative state, took these ideas seriously, that you should not use the federal government for political purposes. So all of the figures featured in this book adopted a nonpartisan technocratic approach to civil service, meaning that they focused on how to make government work, how to offer up real solutions, and were not entirely obsessed with politics. Their moderate approach to civil service clashed with a Nixonian approach to politics. And this is important because in recent years, especially as the Republican Party has moved in a more rightward direction, whether we're talking about a cultural politics or the handling of the economy, a number of historians and even pundits in the media, and maybe even some of you have argued that Richard Nixon was actually a liberal compared by today's standards, right? He's the president who passed the EPA. He's the president who went to China. He's the president who actually supported the family assistance plan. It was a form of welfare reform, but liberal by today's standards. And there's a host of other issues that you can point to. I feel like while some of these accomplishments deserve more credit than others in terms of if we're talking about Richard Nixon, it ignores the fact that the way that Richard Nixon saw politics and the way that Richard Nixon handled things behind the scenes was that he often aligned himself with tough-minded conservatives. This is something you hear on the tapes over and over again. This is one conversation where he said, I'd rather have a dumb conservative because I know that they're loyal than some bright, smart neuter. And the neuters were people like George Shultz and Elliot Richardson, okay? And so when you listen to the tapes, you see that, yeah, Richard Nixon's a complicated ideological figure. He's not a doctrinaire conservative like someone like Ronald Reagan, who's complicated in his own ways, but he's not a hardcore ideological conservative. But when it comes to the culture wars, when it comes to organizing government, when it comes to punishing his enemies, Watergate and the White House tapes show that Nixon saw himself as in line with the right wing in the United States. And there's no better quote that probably summarizes this than M. Stanton Evans, a conservative activist. He was involved in Barry Goldwater's campaign in 1964. He was one of many conservatives who thought that Richard Nixon was too moderate, never really trusted him. But he said this decades later to journalist/scholar Rick Perlstein, author of the famous book Nixonland. He said, "I was never for Richard Nixon until Watergate." So think about that for a second. You know, people who hear the White House tapes, most of them are disgusted, but not all of them are. Remember, when Richard Nixon resigned, he still had a 25 to 28% of the people on his side. And given the events of the last 40 years, it's safe to assume that there's probably some more people who hear the Nixon tapes, study the 1960s and 1970s, and come to different conclusions than someone who would be described as either a moderate, a liberal, or a progressive, or someone further to the left. So that's important when we're describing Nixon's legacy. And so I feel like the stories featured in this book really highlight where Nixon, how we should situate Nixon when explaining the 1960s and 1970s. The real moderates, the real, pragmatists in the Nixon administration are the guys that he's fighting against. Are figures like George Shultz, are figures like Elliot Richardson, are figures like the ones who actually stood up to Nixon's plan to cut federal funds to MIT. Starting in 1970, after a new wave of anti-war protests following the invasion of Cambodia, Richard Nixon creates a plan where he wants to punish universities for their anti-war protests. This is something that hasn't been covered at all in studies of the Nixon administration. And so this plan, which was initially dismissed as a rant, his advisors occasionally would recognize a rant for what it was, as something that was crazy and shouldn't be carried out. But if the rant's brought up enough, they're forced to actually take action. And so this plan, where Nixon wanted to punish first MIT and then other elite universities for their anti-war protests and their liberal university presidents, he thought these presidents should punish students more, is eventually acted on in 1972 and 1973. Fortunately, it's never carried out, but once again, it's stopped because of figures within the administration. Specifically, 3 assistant directors within the OMB by the names of William Morrill, Paul O'Neill, and Kenneth Dam. The name Paul O'Neill may be recognizable to some of you guys. He was the Secretary of Treasury during the George W. Bush administration and resigned because of his policy differences with George W. Bush, who he thought was moving too far to the right, especially on economic and environmental issues. Now, there are numerous tapes that I feature in this book that document this plan, which you see some action taken on this plan in spring of 1972 and then again in early 1973. It fades away once Watergate becomes a national story in the spring of 1973. But real action is taken on this plan. This is a conversation from May 18th, 1972. And it's Richard Nixon telling his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, one thing that Ehrlichman is dragging his feet on because of Shultz. Once again, George Shultz actually played a big role in this, blocking this plan too. He supported his employees in blocking this plan. And now that we got Shultz the hell out of the OMB, I want you to get Weinberger, who's the new head of office management and budget, Caspar Weinberger. I realize I'm throwing a lot of names at you guys, but what's important is that he saw him as someone who would be more loyal, someone who can actually act on this plan. So Nixon said, I want those funds cut off for that MIT. All right, you get a hold of Weinberger and say, I want the goddamn funds, and I want them to know it now. Get it done. Pretty direct order. And it's not a coincidence that this is the 10th or 12th time Nixon has brought up this plan, that Caspar Weinberger, the head of the OMB, starts to write up reports on how this plan could actually be carried out. He starts delivering recommendations to the president. And once again, the order is brought to the 3 assistant directors of the OMB, Paul O'Neill, William Morrill, and Kenneth Dam. And they threatened to resign in January of 1973. They even threatened to go to the press after they resigned. But George Shultz, who's now Secretary of Treasury, tells them, don't worry, I will talk to the White House, I will talk to H.R. Haldeman, I'm going to handle it. You guys do not have to resign. And they never heard about the order again. Caspar Weinberger tried to carry out this plan without their help. It made it much more difficult to do. And he continues to deliver reports. He's slow walking it a little bit, but he still knows that this is a real possibility. But the report, in terms of the archival evidence, drops out by March, April of 1973, and that's not a coincidence. That's when Nixon starts to get real heat for the Watergate scandal. The last time it's brought up on the tapes is in June of 1973, where Richard Nixon meets with George Shultz. And Richard Nixon awkwardly brings up George Shultz's loyalty to MIT. He was an alum of MIT, and he kind of digs at George Shultz a little bit, saying, well, that's why this order never happened. And they just kind of laugh, and then they move on to another subject. Much like the current president, Nixon hated direct confrontations, so he never actually confronted any of these people who were resisting him behind the scenes. So this is another story that's featured in my book, the OMB blocking Nixon's efforts to fully politicize the distribution of federal money to universities. Now you can come to the conclusion that, hey, maybe it would have been good to get the federal government off of our campuses. There were plenty of anti-war protesters who were making that argument. But what Nixon wanted to do was to take the funds from schools like MIT, like Harvard, like Yale, these bad liberal schools, and move those funds to good pro-Nixon schools, like in Ohio State, like the University of Tennessee. Like at the time, he thought UT system, the University of Texas, would be a good school system for these funds. So all he wanted to do was just punish schools and reward the pro-Nixon ones. And so I think it's a fair assessment to say this is not a good way to dictate policy in this country, in terms of which schools have protests and which schools do not. So that's a very important story that has not been told up until this point. But the most famous story of resistance to Richard Nixon is something called the Saturday Night Massacre. This is something that maybe even the students in this room are vaguely aware of, and it's because the term has been brought up repeatedly, especially in the last 2 years. The most notable comparison was when Donald Trump fired the man on the right. Who was that? Jim Comey, so former FBI director, served under the Obama administration in the first 4 or 5 months of the Trump administration. He's fired in May of 2017. Many people think that it has something to do with the investigation into Russia's role in the 2016 election. But when he's fired, a lot of people in the media and a lot of historians compared this event to the Saturday Night Massacre. There's important differences, but you can see the similarities. So what was the Saturday Night Massacre? Well, the Saturday Night Massacre was the moment where these two men, Elliot Richardson, who's on the left, and William Ruckelshaus on the right, resigned in protest in October of 1973. Why did they resign? Well, Richard Nixon wanted Elliot Richardson, the then Attorney General of the United States, head of the Justice Department, nothing like Jeff Sessions, but the Jeff Sessions of 1973, he wanted Elliot Richardson to fire the Watergate special prosecutor, Archibald Cox. Nixon was convinced that Cox, who was a liberal Democrat who worked for the Kennedy administration, was out to get him. So what was Cox doing that so enraged Richard Nixon? Well, he was asking for the White House tapes. Specifically, he wanted the White House tapes surrounding the Watergate break-in. Cox and his team of investigators wanted to listen to these tapes to figure out whether or not Richard Nixon was guilty or innocent of a cover-up. Okay? The American public found out that these tapes existed just a few months before the Saturday Night Massacre in July of 1973. When a former White House advisor, Alexander Butterfield, told the nation during a Senate Watergate hearing that there's a taping system. He was one of just a handful of people that knew about this secret voice-activated taping system that started in February of 1971 and ran through, July of 1973. And there's 3,700 hours of White House conversations in this collection. Okay? We now have access to roughly about almost 3,000 hours. The rest have been determined to be too private or personal or deal with national security issues. So the tapes basically are the central issue of the last year of the Watergate story. Watergate investigators, led by Archibald Cox at the time, want the tapes. The American public increasingly is starting to wonder, what does Nixon have to hide? Why does he not want to release the tapes? Nixon and his team of lawyers are figuring out what to do with the tapes. Several lawyers recommend that he actually burn the tapes in the White House lawn. He's arguing to the American people, these tapes are my private property. I don't have to turn them over. But Cox keeps on asking for the tapes. And so what happens on October 19th, 1973, is that Richard Nixon tells Elliot Richardson that you need to fire Archibald Cox. Cox is refusing to accept a compromise plan that was referred to people as the Stennis Compromise. Not to go too into the weeds here, but the Stennis Compromise would have involved a senator by the name of John C. Stennis from Mississippi. He was a Democrat, but he was a pro-Nixon Democrat. Defended the president, especially on his Vietnam policies. Now, John Stennis was an elderly man. He was in his 70s, and he actually had been mugged outside of his home earlier that year. And so this plan would call for John Stennis to be the only person to listen to the tapes and then provide transcripts that would then be handed over to Archibald Cox. Archibald Cox thought this plan was ridiculous. But this is evidence that Cox and Richardson were both moderates and were trying to be loyal to the president. They actually said, hey, we're not going to entirely reject this. Let's use this as the beginning point of a real negotiation. And so the week before the Saturday Night Massacre, they're trying to negotiate with the White House. But Richard Nixon says, no, you have to accept this plan and you have to promise to not ask for any more tapes. Just the tapes that you're asking for, and only John Stennis can listen to them. This elderly man who was known to actually have hearing issues. That's a real story. And as you can tell by just listening to the tapes, the quality isn't that great. You know, even though we have these computers or we can adjust the volumes. So Cox says, I cannot accept that plan. And that is the moment where Richard Nixon tells Elliot Richardson that he needs to fire Archibald Cox. Now, Elliot Richardson, up until this point, was a pretty, even if he was hesitant to do so, was a loyal member of the Nixon administration. But he came from a very different scene than Richard Nixon. Elliot Richardson is perhaps a very, almost borderline stereotypical figure of the Ivy League establishment of the 1960s, 1970s. If you actually, I don't think we have time to watch a clip of Elliot Richardson. He talks in a very slow, monotone voice. He has a very strong, fancy Boston accent. He's from upper class section of Boston. Very kind of highfalutin establishment figure. But he's a figure from a bygone era. The liberal, moderate wing of the Republican Party. So he in many ways embodied that establishment. And he served as Undersecretary of State, the head of HEW, which was then an earlier version of HHS, Health and Human Services, and Secretary of Defense before he was picked to be Attorney General of the United States. The reason he was picked to be Attorney General of the United States was not because Richard Nixon liked him. It's because Richard Nixon saw the value in having him around. Elliot Richardson brought prestige. He calmed down some of the more moderate members of the Republican Party, especially the liberal wing of the Republican Party when there was one in the 1970s. And there's no quote that better kind of summarizes this when Richard Nixon, who was trying to figure out what to do with Elliot Richardson in his staff reorganization, he said, I suppose you've got to keep one person in the goddamn government that's considered to be sort of interested in the people. You see, he has that. Once again, this may sound facetious, but if you actually listen to the tape, there's not much laughter. It's a very serious statement. So once again, he's one of these nice guys that Nixon doesn't like, but he sees the value of keeping him around. And that explains why Elliot Richardson is the Attorney General during such a very important moment for Nixon. It's why Richard Nixon is never comfortable with him. It's why in this one tape, which we don't have time to listen to, he actually attempts to bribe Elliot Richardson with a Supreme Court appointment, saying, hey, you should hang out with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, not so subtly implying you may be next in line. This is a conversation that, once again, has not been publicized, but it just shows how deeply uncomfortable Nixon was with any kind of credible, independent investigation. And then after meeting with Elliot Richardson following his swearing-in ceremony, Nixon calls his new chief of staff, Al Haig, because his old chief of staff is about to go to prison. He complains that there's so many weak people in our cabinet, specifically naming Elliot Richardson and George Shultz. Richard Nixon says, see, Richardson's in the spot where, as you know, he's going to have to prove that he's the white knight and all that bull. And so he's going to try to, he and Archie Cox will try to try the president. You know, well, and all that crap. How do you handle that? Well, this all eventually leads to the Saturday Night Massacre. So to get back to October of 1973, fast forward a little bit, Richardson's given the order. And while Richardson is being told by his advisors to resist the order, to resign in protest, Elliot Richardson is very hesitant to do so. He has a deep respect for the presidency. And it really shows this disconnect between Nixon's own version of Elliot Richardson, where he thinks Richardson's just this careerist who is deeply disloyal to Nixon, and then Elliot Richardson's own personal notes, where he is really, really hesitant to stand up to the president in this public of a fashion. But he eventually comes to the conclusion, after hashing it out with his staff and talking to his wife and even his kids, he decides he needs to resign. And so he does so on October 20th, 1973. The very same day, Archibald Cox has a press conference where he tells the American people, I cannot accept the Stennis Compromise. I need real access to the tapes. And so Elliot Richardson resigns. William Ruckelshaus, to go back to this slide, also resigns. He's another moderate Republican. He was actually the head of the EPA when Nixon created the EPA. What many people don't know is that when William Ruckelshaus, who's an actual moderate, he kept on fighting with the Nixon White House, who constantly wanted to make the EPA a weak administration. Later on, Ruckelshaus is picked to be the Deputy Attorney General, and when Elliot Richardson resigns, Ruckelshaus sees this as an easy decision. He says, yeah, I have to resign too, because this is messed up. It's unlike Elliot Richardson, who goes back and forth and takes a lot of notes on this decision. Ruckelshaus, for him, it's a very quick and easy decision to make. And he tells historians that later, years later, saying, I saw it as an improper use of government, and he resigns in protest.
It helps when you have 300,000 warehouses stock.
I'm sorry?
It helps when you have 300,000 shares of warehouses stock.
Yes. Well, I mean, a lot of the figures here, though, are wealthy.
Yeah, just a comment.
Yeah, that is a fact. So what happens in the end is that they both resign, and Robert Bork, who later on becomes more famous as Ronald Reagan's Supreme Court nominee in 1987, Robert Bork is the Solicitor General. This is how unprecedented all this was. He did not even know he was third in line until that very week. All right, so they're all kind of improvising this. But Robert Bork does fire Archibald Cox. And that's the Saturday Night Massacre. Hours later, Richard Nixon orders the FBI to go to Cox's offices and seal off the office. This is an office that belongs to the Justice Department. And so it's Richard Nixon telling the FBI to seal the office, and these images are broadcast to the American people. And reporters soon label this as the Saturday Night Massacre, a very dramatic term. But that night, people thought that this was an unprecedented event, and it was Richard Nixon acting like a dictator. Fortunately for the nation, the public backlash was gigantic. This is the moment where, even though Nixon's approval ratings had dropped before this, his approval ratings dropped even further, from 38 to 28%. And more importantly, a plurality of voters now support impeachment. Remember, no president had been impeached in over a century. So impeachment was still something that was uncharted, territory for all living Americans in the 1970s. And so this moment is a key turning point where more Americans and more people in Congress are now taking impeachment seriously. And it's the beginning of the end for Richard Nixon. What happens in the end is that Richard Nixon, because he's facing this backlash, actually picks a new Watergate special prosecutor, who ironically enough, ends up taking a tougher stance on the tapes than Archibald Cox. It's Leon Jaworski, a Democrat from Texas. And he's the one that basically gets the tapes, takes the case to the Supreme Court. The tapes come out in the summer of 1974. Evidence comes out that Nixon is guilty of a criminal conspiracy and certainly guilty of a cover-up, and he resigns in August of 1974. But the Saturday Night Massacre, which is the last chapter of this book, shows that it's not just a single moment, it's connected to all these other stories of Republicans who resisted Nixon's abuses of powers. It's connected to this clash of a moderate, nonpartisan approach to organizing the federal government and a more cutthroat version, a Nixonian approach to politics and civil service. And so, as the Saturday Night Massacre gets brought up repeatedly in 2018, it's important to know the details. And it's important to know what was truly at stake. Because many Nixon loyalists, not only at the Nixon Library in Corpus Linda, California, but also in the media, not just in Fox News, are increasingly depicting the Saturday Night Massacre as a moment where the liberal media was unfair to Richard Nixon. All right? That's not the majority view. If you look at polls of Nixon today, 2018, it's standing still pretty low. But increasingly, especially since Trump's victory in 2016, more Republicans are now coming out to defend Richard Nixon. It's not the majority view, but I've noticed it's been happening more and more. Just recently, a Fox News personality, Greg Jarrett, who has a popular new book on the Russia investigation, he defends Donald Trump. He actually said on Sean Hannity's show that Richard Nixon was right to do what he did during the Saturday Night Massacre. Very interesting. This is something that Republicans never said before, and he's saying it. Another figure who's made that argument numerous times is a former Nixon administration official. He was a speechwriter, Pat Buchanan, who of course is a kind of a very iconic figure in history of conservatism and the Republican Party of the last 40 to 50 years. Well, here he is speaking at the Nixon Library in May of 1917, and this is his version of the Saturday Night Massacre. So this is not the 1970s, it's not the 1980s, this is in 2017. And the audience's reaction is very interesting.
Russians reportedly have been putting nuclear weapons in ships that are moving toward the Bosphorus and Dardanelles. Their airborne divisions are moving toward airfields. And we've got American forces on heightened alert. I cannot have my Attorney General successfully defy me when we've got Brezhnev over there watching my reaction to what's going on. I've got no choice but to do it. And to this day, I think the president had no choice. I think he did the right thing. Maybe they're going to call me back to another committee here. But that's this.
So the audience's reaction is very telling. I know there was actually 500 people in the crowd. So you hear, and I mean, I cannot prove this, but I know there are some former Nixon administration officials at the event, because Pat Buchanan refers to them. They may be the ones clapping at the beginning, and then eventually a few dozen other people clap. But it's a very awkward applause line, you know, for someone who was greeted with a standing applause when he came in. So, like I said, this is not the majority view of Nixon and Watergate. But in the age of Trump, as people are starting to compare, or have compared Nixon to Trump in a much more public fashion, it's not going to be surprising if more people make arguments like this. Okay? That more conservatives start to revisit the Nixon administration and say, hey, in the wake of everything that was going on in the 60s and 70s, in the wake of an anti-war movement and war in the Middle East, which Pat Buchanan referred to, and radical left-wing movements that were sometimes violent, Nixon was right to do this, right? And so the links between Nixon and Trump are very, very important. They were not only acquaintances in the 1980s. This is a photograph taken in the late 80s. Does anyone know who the man in the middle is? I realize the lighting's maybe blur this a little bit. That's John. Yeah, very good. John Connelly, former Democratic Texas governor, was famously actually in the limousine with John F. Kennedy in 1963 when the president was assassinated. John Connelly later became a more conservative figure and was one of Richard Nixon's closest allies. Nixon actually wanted him to run as an independent conservative in 1976. It did not happen. But Connelly later on was one of the key figures who introduced Richard Nixon in the late 80s to Donald Trump, who you see right here. They would go to Yankee games occasionally. George Steinbrenner was another mutual friend. Richard Nixon even wrote a letter to Donald Trump that got publicized in the last year or two. That it was Donald Trump after he appeared on the Phil Donahue show. And he was talking about politics, he was talking about New York City, and Richard Nixon said, you have a real career, a real future in politics if you want one. So this is a pretty direct link, you can't make this up. And Donald Trump and his staff in 2016, I don't know if they actually did this, they probably didn't, claimed that they were going to frame the photo, or frame the letter and place it in the Oval Office. You contrast this with the fact that the new Justice Department, led by Jeff Sessions, reportedly removed a portrait of Elliot Richardson. A portrait that had stood there for decades, that was placed on the wall for decades for both Republican and Democratic administrations. Don't know why it was taken down, but one can only speculate why they felt the need to remove a portrait of a moderate liberal Republican who stood up to Richard Nixon. So these stories definitely matter. Nixon and Trump are not only connected through their shared view of politics and the presidency, they're also connected through law and order politics. A heavy emphasis on law and order, a heavy emphasis on loyalty. And so despite their policy differences, there are clear policy differences, their view of politics is what really matters. They are both defined by what they oppose, okay? And they're both defined by their authoritarian streaks, to put it nicely. And so Trump's presidency is deeply connected to the ongoing debate, whether or not you know it's a debate or not, the ongoing debate over Nixon's legacy. So I just want to wrap things up by just reading a very, very short passage from the book. It is worth noting that very few in 1972 would have expected resistance for Republicans in the Nixon administration. With the help of new archival records, we now know the full scope of their actions. George Shultz, Johnny Walters, Kenneth Dam, William Worrell, Paul Neal, William Ruckelshaus, Elliot Richardson, and many others all said no to the president because they were all fiercely dedicated to preserving a strong culture of nonpartisan civil service within the federal government. It was a culture that shaped their careers and is one that they felt was necessary to protect. While Nixon did not see any strength in the men who resisted his orders, their collective stand was powerful enough to block the president's attempts to institutionalize the use of power. They chose integrity over loyalty, and as a result, Nixon was prevented from dramatically expanding his presidential powers. Nixon often complained that there were too many principled men in his administration, but there were just enough nice guys to stop him from dramatically undermining constitutional democracy. Thank you.
Okay, so we have time for questions, comments, voices.
Now really scary because there seems to be like no check on Donald Trump. Like there's no moderate Republicans. He has his own like state TV media like Fox News. I mean, if he was like really smart, he could be doing like some damage.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a question there, but yeah, I mean, you pointed out some of the key differences. It brings up a few points. One, that the Nixon administration also has connections to the rise of Fox News. The head of Fox News, Roger Ailes, who passed away last year after he resigned in disgrace due to numerous allegations of sexual abuse, harassment, and you name it. He actually started his career in politics as a media advisor to Richard Nixon in 1968. And he wrote memos to Richard Nixon saying, hey, we should fund a conservative network. They talked about that in 1969, 1970. It doesn't happen until 1996 after a few other attempts in the 80s and early 90s. But that idea is talked about in the late 60s and early 70s. Because what they point out is that the media establishment, remember back then, this may be hard to understand for the younger people in the room, you only have a few channels. And your news is mostly coming from NBC, CBS, and ABC. And because of the culture and politics of the mid-20th century, yes, it does have a liberal bent. The liberal bias is exaggerated by many conservative activists, but it does have a liberal bent, as it does to a certain extent today. I mean, the significance of that can be debated on and on and on, but the Nixon administration is often frustrated by this, and they want to create their own media outlets. And so Roger Ailes is an important link, probably even more substantial than Nixon's friendship with Donald Trump. Roger Ailes was a key media advisor who told Nixon this is how you get around traditional media routes. Now, your point about there being no moderate Republicans is correct. I mean, who's labeled a moderate Republican in 2018?
Jeff Flake.
Jeff Flake. All right, so then what does Jeff Flake do?
He retired.
Well, exactly, he's retiring. So the idea of what a moderate is incredibly superficial. A moderate in 2018 is anyone who expresses the mildest of concerns about Donald Trump's tweets. What does that actually do? Exactly. It's a very, one question I've been getting from people is saying, well, what do you think about the anonymous op-ed, which a lot of people think came from a moderate within the administration? I mean, that's debated because, you know, I mean, the person also is, in that op-ed is also espousing pretty conservative views too. But let's say they're a moderate, they take a more moderate approach to civil service. They're doing this anonymously, you know, and they're doing it also in a very public way. Contrast that with these figures who are doing this in a much more substantial way, and they're doing it behind the scenes. You know, so I think that's also an important difference in terms of understanding what a moderate is, who were moderates in the Nixon era, and who are moderates today. And I think, as I said during my talk, we should expect more from whoever presents themselves or brands themselves as a moderate in 2018. It takes more than just going on Sunday morning talk shows and saying, I think Donald Trump's sexist or racist comments or anti-Semitic comments were uncalled for, and then you do nothing. You know, we should actually call for real action to provide real checks on what seems like a dangerous presidency. But I'll add one more note. As I said in my concluding remarks, archives that come out 30, 40, 50 years from now, if they exist, if they're not being destroyed right now, could show us maybe real signs of resistance. We don't know. But based on the current political climate, I think it is fair to be cynical.
What about McCain?
I mean, once again, I mean, John, I don't want to speak ill of the dead. What did John McCain actually do? What did he do in 2016? What did he do in terms of supporting a stronger, credible investigation into Russia in 2016 election and possible connections to the Trump campaign?
What did you do about the VA system?
Exactly. With the exception of continuing to, you know, take a strong stance on torture, which he deserves a lot of credit for, there's not much. By all accounts, his vote on health care was based on a pretty superficial opposition to Trump. You know, in terms of, let's say if Donald Trump was actually polite to John McCain, would we have gotten that health care vote? The fact that we're not confident in answering that question tells you a lot. And so I think John McCain, unfortunately, even though Jeff Flake is kind of the more comical figure in terms of just how he doesn't do anything, I think there's a lot of similarities there. In terms of this branding yourself as a moderate is not always linked to actual acts of resistance. They're certainly true during the Bush era.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry, Stephanie.
Okay, so basically I have a question related to the Saturday Night Massacre.
Yeah.
I know in 1971, Daniel Ellsberg released the Pentagon Papers and all that.
Right.
Does that have some correlation towards that? Because I know that was also a big factor in why Nixon resigned.
Yes.
So I'm kind of like a little conflicted on like those two segments. So can you explain like
Oh,
that?
definitely. Yeah, Daniel Ellsberg's decision to leak the Pentagon Papers, first, of course, to the New York Times, then the Washington Post and other media outlets, is definitely an important moment in the Nixon presidency. While there were definite unethical uses of federal government prior to that, after the release of the Pentagon Papers, that is when Richard Nixon and his key officials in the White House create the Plumbers Union. The Plumbers Union was made up of figures who used to work for the CIA, most notably G. Gordon Liddy, who's still kicking around, E. Howard Hunt, who their first major operation was breaking into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. It's known by many people as Watergate West. Their final operation was getting caught at the Watergate Hotel. But between those two moments are a lot of other attempts to sabotage Democratic campaigns during Democratic primaries in late 71 and 1972. There's a lot of other projects and plans that just openly violate the law. There are a lot of warrantless wiretaps. And that all happens because of Daniel Ellsberg. All right? Maybe it would have happened without, but that's what causes this escalation of surveillance happening within, that's being carried out by Nixon administration officials. They're being supervised by Nixon administration officials. One thing people often ask is, how is this different from what J. Edgar Hoover had been doing since the 1920s? Well, there is a key difference here. One, J. Edgar Hoover scaled back his operation shortly before his death, because I think he was afraid of it being publicized. I think he thought the late 60s, early 70s was an era where the public was becoming more aware of what the government was doing with regard to surveillance. So he scales back just at the same time that Nixon wants him to escalate his activities. And so what Nixon does is he brings those operations inside of the White House. That's what makes Richard Nixon exceptional. And what really spurs that development is the Ellsberg leak. And the first thing that happens is, of course, the break-in in Los Angeles in August of 1971. Nixon may not be ordering these specific operations, but he is just one person removed, and he is vaguely aware of what's happening. The Ellsberg break-in, for example, John Ehrlichman, who's featured in the tapes, is top domestic advisor, by second most influential advisor to Nixon, maybe third if you include Kissinger. He tells Nixon after the break-in happens, saying, we had an operation in Los Angeles that was aborted, you don't need to know the details. And Nixon says, agreed. So one can assume that Nixon kind of knew that it was targeted towards Ellsberg, since this conversation took place in August of 1971. And it gives you a sense that when Nixon participates in the Watergate cover-up, he doesn't care about the Watergate break-in. What he cares about is the dozens and dozens of other activities that he had helped organize, either directly or indirectly, starting in the summer of 1971, following Ellsberg's.
Can I just ask you a question?
Yeah.
Can you clarify? So when you talk about the Nixon tapes, he was taping himself?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, and some of these things I've glossed over in this presentation just for the sake of time, but that is one question that's worth going into the details. So yeah, Richard Nixon sets up this voice-activated taping system in February of 1971.
Double reel.
Yeah, and so why did he do this? This captured every single conversation that took place in the Oval Office, on his White House telephone, in the executive office building, in the cabinet room. So all these cabinet officials did not know that they were being recorded. And at Camp David. That took a few more months, but eventually Camp David was also set up. So as a result, we have 3,700 hours of private conversations. The only people who knew about this taping system were Richard Nixon, his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, Alexander Butterfield, who's the guy who under oath talked about it in the summer of 1973. He didn't want to go to prison for perjury, especially for a president he didn't particularly like by 1953. And a few Secret Service agents and a few White House just facility guys. That was it. So Henry Kissinger did not know about it. Even John Ehrlichman did not know about it. Any visitor to the White House certainly did not know about it. So why did Richard Nixon do this? We don't have a definitive answer to that question, but there's a lot of decent guesses. For one, Richard Nixon, who saw these tapes as his private property, and there was precedent for that argument. What presidents did before this was that they would have their archives, treat it like private property, and then deed it over to the federal government. And Nixon saw his tapes as a part of that process. Well, he sets up the taping system because he wants a definitive record for his memoirs. All right? He's especially concerned with getting a very sweet financial deal after his presidency is done for his memoirs. And he actually ends up getting them, but it's mostly to repay a lot of his legal debts after Watergate. But so he wants a definitive record to show off all of his accomplishments. Now, why is he obsessed with that? Well, starting in 1970 and early 71, he becomes especially frustrated with Henry Kissinger and others who are taking credit for his accomplishments, who are developing relationships with people in the media, kind of talking them off the record and saying, oh no, I'm the secret genius within the Nixon administration. So Henry Kissinger is probably at the top of the list of people who are, and you can hear this on the tapes, it happens even after the taping system is set off, where Nixon is saying, oh, Henry is taking credit for this, Henry is taking credit for China, Henry is taking credit for the peace process in Vietnam, blah,
And
blah,
he's
blah.
still at it.
Yeah, well, yes. Yeah, I mean, he just did a talk at NYU a week ago. And yeah, I mean, it is an incredibly successful PR campaign for Henry Kissinger. He does take a lot of credit. And one thing that's not told enough is that Henry Kissinger is just as nuts as Richard Nixon. Yet he's much smarter and savvier with how he deals with the media. And that's true even in 2018. He's 95, 96 years old. He is still at it. So I think that is why Nixon sets up the taping system. But that is ultimately his downfall. While a lot of people like to say that the system worked with Watergate, if you take out the White House tapes, you can see a situation where Nixon is just simply censored, maybe impeached by a Democratic House, but not removed from office. That certainly would not have happened without the hard evidence that we have with the White House tapes. One final note, other presidents have tapes. You may have seen some of them on YouTube possibly, but none of them were voice activated. Nixon's was voice activated because his advisors knew he was kind of clumsy with technology, so they didn't trust him to press the on and off button. Other presidents, like John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, also had secret tapes, but they had an on and off button. Because of the voice-activated part of the system, Nixon's collection far outweighs any others. The next closest is Johnson's, and his is about 650, 700 hours. Nixon's, once again, is 3,700 hours.
First of all, I just want you to know that I think 71 is not elderly. I think you can call it older on behalf of those who are 70 in the audience. Second, may I ask why you chose just to concentrate on Nixon? Because the abuse of power actually, I think, started with FDR. And in my estimation, Nixon is a product of World War II and of FDR and, of course, the Churchill memoirs. So how come you didn't take a wider view of this and just concentrate on just do Nixon? And lastly, yes, I believe that the taping started with Kennedy. And of course, I think that you're absolutely right. Nixon wanted to use his memoirs. It's a shame he just didn't destroy it, because I'm sure that there were other conversations like this. And I don't think it was so much J. Edgar Hoover, but actually FDR went after his enemies using the IRS.
Yes, there's definitely evidence of that.
Maybe this could be another book.
Possibly. I guess the short answer to the question, why didn't I trust other ones, is time. That's a gigantic project. I'd say that's a 1,000-page book. Larger than that. But it's also connected to a belief I have about Richard Nixon. And I understand, because we have unprecedented access to the Nixon administration, there's no way to prove this. And I think it's a fair assumption. You could say that other administrations had their fair share of abuses of power. But as someone who listened to the Nixon tapes, I think there's something different going on with Nixon. And I think it's something that we need to confront. I would maybe take what you just said, but reverse it a little bit, saying, because we have this evidence, we have to acknowledge just how bad this is. Maybe it's not fair. Maybe other presidents committed worse crimes. We don't know. What I can tell you, based on my own research, and I'm still learning, of course, is that other presidents removed themselves from using the levers of government in this kind of way. All right? That's not true in all the cases. When we're talking about whether it's FDR, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, I mean, you name all the presidents. But what you really hear in the Nixon tapes is a deep-seated cynicism about government. That is just, in some ways, overbearing. It's depressing. And maybe I'm biased as someone who worked in the Nixon Library, as someone who only listened to these tapes, and has only listened to a few tapes from the Kennedy and Johnson administration. Based on my own limited interactions with those other collections, Nixon's exceptional. Yeah, there's an imperial presidency that's dangerous, that should be criticized by historians and people today in 2018. Yes, we should point out what FDR did and point out what Johnson and Kennedy and everyone else did in the 40s, 50s, 60s. But the Nixon tapes really highlight the fact that, and to paraphrase something that Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein bring up still to this day, and that has, and they're journalists, so their work, is limited to a certain extent. But if you listen to the Nixon tapes, you never hear Richard Nixon say, "What's good for the country?" There's never any real sense of optimism. And as someone who's no fan of Ronald Reagan, granted we have limited access to his archival records, just by his very personality and reading his biographies, you get the sense that there is a sense of optimism, a strong sense of optimism that guided Reagan's politics. All right, that's maybe the only nice thing I'll say about it. But it's there, and it's something you cannot ignore and you need to confront. With Nixon, based on my own time, I spent every Friday listening to these tapes for the better part of a year. It would really leave me in a really terrible mood that my wife eventually noticed. It's just 24/7 cynicism. It's always scheming. It's always politics. It's never really driven by, even with the things that he actually is passionate about. He's constantly trying to find a way to use this for political advantage in a way that I would hope, maybe I'm naive, is not present in most other administrations. But let's focus on ways we can actually compare Nixon to other presidential administrations. I think the Hoover piece is important because the fact that Nixon is micromanaging these crimes, is micromanaging these abuses of power, does make him exceptional. Okay? It does make him different. And if we don't confront that, then any president can be rehabilitated. Okay? That's my argument. That if we cannot confront the archival record and see all these things and say that is exceptional, that is incredibly bad, I would say it's much healthier for the country to call it out as exceptionally bad. Because if we don't do that, then any president in American history can be rehabilitated by just simply saying all presidents do it. All right, this is an argument that I did not believe before I worked in the Nixon Library, but through working with the records, listening to the tapes, it's an argument that I've kind of come to buy, that Nixon is exceptional in significant ways, even if it is important to not romanticize other, especially post-war presidents, including FDR. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. Let's have a student and then.
Yeah.
What really brought me in when you said vote up so many weak people in our cabinet. I think it makes so much sense how he aligned with those hard hats that would go and beat the hell out of the new left. It's such a dynamic president in American history. He did so many things for so many sides, between the bombing campaign in Vietnam and putting a pin in that. And his support for universal basic income and starting the EPA. It just seems that he did so much to please so many sides. And what was he driven out for? Watergate. And how he was the only president. But I guess my question for you is, what motivated you to write about him? Because he must be really fun to write about.
Yeah.
Is it like the clown car of the media that we have today that's echoing it with Trump and Russia?
Well, I mean, the one thing I start off the acknowledgement section of this book is, ever since, and it's interesting, I did not start my graduate student career focusing on Richard Nixon. I focused on the 1960s, but it wasn't on Richard Nixon. But when I was a kid, I was drawn to Richard Nixon. I even dressed up as Richard Nixon for Halloween one time. This is like in the mid-90s. And the reason I did it is because he kept on popping up in popular culture. He's one of those presidents, whether it's Teddy Roosevelt or FDR or John F. Kennedy, that you always see in movies, TV shows, even cartoons. And as a Simpsons fan, someone who's very nerdy about The Simpsons, Harry Shearer, who would voice Richard Nixon, Nixon would pop up on The Simpsons a lot in the early to mid-90s. And Nixon just seemed like this sad sack character, someone who seemed personality-wise and looks-wise very different than other presidents. I was drawn to that, so I thought he was a funny character. And it's why during my 6th grade dance at actually St. Francis Middle School in central Connecticut, I dressed up as Richard Nixon. And weirdly, actually, my very first slow dance with a girl, she was dressed up as a hippie. So it was Richard Nixon. This is a true story. And it was 1995, so it was after Forrest Gump came out, so everyone was dressing up like Jenny and Forrest Gump. That was a popular costume that year. People were confused by my costume. Other kids who dressed up like presidents dressed up like Bill Clinton. 1995, that makes sense. But I thought, I got a mask from Kmart, and I thought it was funny. My teachers thought it was funny, my classmates thought it was weird. But let me go back to that, because I think because of Nixon's unique personality, that's why I think people were willing to give him a more fair shake, saying like, if you really study Nixon's biography, you can very easily fall into this idea that he deserves our sympathy. And his story, of course, is a tragic one. I mean, an important contrast to the past and the present is that Nixon's a smart guy. He's a bright guy. And he's a studier. He's a hard worker. That's something you cannot deny. But if you really kind of fall in love with this biography, this guy who came up from a rural, kind of almost very poor background in Southern California and worked his way up, didn't have the looks, didn't really have the traditional charisma. It's fair contrasted with someone like John F. Kennedy, whose career was, in many cases bought and paid for by his father. It's very easily to kind of, like I said, become sympathetic to Richard Nixon. However, that does not excuse everything you hear on the tapes. Someone can have that biography and then still rise above it. And so one thing I'm troubled with in 2018 is that a lot of people will look at Nixon's life, look at the fact that he is a complicated figure, unlike the current president, who I think is relatively easy to explain, and kind of, like I said, almost like develop an admiration for him. That's fine. I mean, I'm not going to tell you who you should admire or not, but you still need to confront what you hear on the tapes. All right? You still need to confront the fact that this is a president who's micromanaging a criminal operation coming from the White House. And so if you're able to combine the two, the fact that he's this complicated, tragic figure with fully confronting everything that encompasses Watergate, that's fine. What I'm troubled by is that historians often will focus on the former, and then they kind of get away from the latter. And that's something that this book tries to argue against. It's something you see in a lot of Nixon biographies. I would say most of them, actually, where people spend a lot of time studying Nixon's life, and then they soften their stance when it comes to Watergate. This is especially true of baby boomers, who in the 70s were, in many cases hated Nixon. And then because of the politics of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, they softened their stance on Nixon. I think, you need to get away from that personal connection to Nixon and confront the archival evidence.
You have a question?
Yeah, perhaps you can comment on this. What I think perhaps is that we should have a different view of politicians. Because I think we seem to feel that when they're in office, they're supposed to act nobly and stuff like that. But I think the system is there to be exploited. I think this is what we're getting. The concern I have is that the system learns, but as citizens we do not have that opportunity to ensure a check and balance in terms of what is going on.
I think that's a fair statement. One thing that's connected to this is that after Nixon resigns, you get a lot of pundits saying, well, this shows that the system worked. Nixon was forced to leave office. And is replaced by Gerald Ford, who by most accounts is, whether you feel that, I mean, he's not connected to Watergate at all, and he's a relatively honorable man, So he becomes president in 1974. You get all these pieces about the system works. But all these figures who were celebrating Watergate, it's very telling what happens to their political careers. Elliot Richardson, does he become president of the United States? Does he become a prominent figure in the Republican Party? No.
Yeah.
He's briefly talked about as a vice presidential candidate in 1976. Gerald Ford thought he could use him to separate himself from the legacy of Watergate. He decides to go another direction because he does not want to anger the growing conservative movement, who at that time is becoming actually more loyal to the memory of Richard Nixon. Elliot Richardson then runs for Senate in Massachusetts, not a hotbed of conservatism, but runs for the Senate in Massachusetts. He loses in the Republican primary by 20 points, even though he's seen as the favorite. He loses to a very Trump-like candidate by the name of Ray Cheney, a Boston area businessman, who then eventually loses to John Kerry. That's when John Kerry becomes senator of Massachusetts. So, I mean, granted, some of these figures do have political careers, actually not political careers, careers in government. The fact that none of these figures actually rise above and become real leaders of the Republican Party is very telling. And it shows that, yes, in that brief moment, maybe people thought the system worked and provided some checks on an authoritarian presidency. But it's fleeting, and it fades away pretty quickly by the mid to late 1970s.
Because you said it was the people who, public opinion that really forced it.
I've been in the New York Times reader for 60 years. And for 40 of those years, I remember there was diversity in the two parties. You had those wonderful little listings in the New York Times who in Congress voted for the bill or against the bill. And with both parties would there'd be diversity there. That sort of disappeared, I don't know, somewhere around in the aughts. 10 years, 20, 15 years. So we've moved to absolute discipline. That comes from the money. You know, nobody in the party wants to go against the party because they're not going to get the money to run, and running is so expensive. So this is on the legislative side, we've lost some of the check and balance.
Yeah, and I think the story of
intra-party checks and balance.
Yeah, I think the story of legislation in this country in terms of how party members vote is connected to this story in terms of how administration officials actually reacted to a president. They are not separate. They're part of the same story. And it's why I think a lot of people are worried about the president in terms of, more people in 2018 have accepted kind of Nixon's approach to loyalty, a stricter sense of loyalty to your party and to your president. And if you veer away from that, sure, you can make a statement here and there, but if you really veer away from that, you're going to be punished. And so that is an important development in the last
I
few
worked in the
decades.
Nixon administration,
Oh, you did?
and they had operatives in each of the departments
Yes.
that made sure that you behaved yourself.
Well, one guy
Very
that
interesting.
I didn't have time to talk about in the IRS story is they had an operative by the name of Roger Barth, and he was a Nixon loyalist. And whenever he would sit in a meeting and he heard his boss Johnny Walters talk about we're not going to do this, we're not going to do this, he called John Ehrlichman 5 minutes later. And so that's one example connected to your own experience. But I mean, certainly, yeah, the parties were very different back then. There's a new book focused on the history of impeachment in this country, and there's a chapter written on the Nixon years by my former supervisor at the Nixon Library, Timothy Naftali. He was the first federal director of the Nixon Library. What he really kind of goes into great detail in this chapter is he shows how Republicans actually came on board with the impeachment idea. It was a process, but the fact that they're actually willing to negotiate with Democrats and willing to be a part of these conversations show that it was a different era back then than in 2018. It'd be very hard to imagine, having Republican senators and congressmen and congresswomen going up to the president of the United States and telling them, I'm going to vote for impeachment. And to be fair, you can say vice versa, the same could be true of the Democratic president. But we're just in a much more dramatic moment under a Republican president.
Naftali's a cool guy. He actually gave me a tour of the library in York Linda. I've been there about 3 times.
Oh, great.
Also, Roger Stone is one of those guys from the scandal kind of used it as like a launch pad, sort of like behind the scenes. He is like a pretty intricate part of like Trump sort of like journey towards running for office. Yeah. That's it.
So how many of you guys, raise your hands, how many of you guys know who Roger Stone is? Yeah, well, I'm glad you got a tour of the Nixon Library. But Roger Stone started his career as a young Republican. He actually was one of the people on the ground, granted it was a low level, during the 1972 Nixon campaign who was participating in what he referred to as a campaign to rat fuck their enemies. Okay? That was their words. That involved sending out fake mailers to trick voters in New Hampshire and to really mess up the Democratic primary campaign. Roger Stone then later on became a pretty important Republican operative in the 1980s and 90s. Kind of got cut off in the Republican establishment starting in the late 90s, but then came back into the Republican fold as a pretty key advisor to Donald Trump in 2015. Along with John Connelly, Roger Stone was another one egging on Donald Trump to befriend Richard Nixon in the 1980s. So Roger Stone, who has a pretty impressive collection of Nixon memorabilia, actually has a Nixon tattoo on his back, which he proudly shows off in 2015, 16, 17, 18. Now, can you imagine a Republican operative showing off their Nixon tattoo in the 80s and 90s? No. So, granted, it's one guy, and Roger Stone is an eccentric figure, but he's someone who, like I said, is at the center in many ways of the Russia investigation, was a part of the Trump campaign in 2015, and he's showing off a Nixon tattoo. You cannot ignore this stuff. Up until 2015, he was very active online, whether it's Facebook threads or Twitter posts, in arguing with Nixon historians. My former supervisor, Timothy Naftali, was actually harassed by Roger Stone. Whenever my boss occasionally shows up on CNN, would show up on CNN, Roger Stone tweeted out to his hundreds of thousands of followers homophobic slurs.
He was also Manafort's partner, wasn't he?
Right.
Yes. Yeah. So Roger Stone is, like I said, this nutty figure who's easy to dismiss, but he provides another interesting link between the Nixon and Trump years. And while Nixon was not Trump personality-wise, he hung out with Roger Stone. I'm not saying that Richard Nixon had a very different personality than Donald Trump. Some similarities, but very different. But it's very telling that both hung out with Roger Stone. Yeah.
He also, I think, sort of found like a loophole to where like you could start creating like attack ads for campaigns because they found out that they would run out of money for campaign ads for a candidate that you're working with Orange, he sort of like started the like modern day like attack at.
Oh yeah.
But
No,
also he told Donald Trump to like run for office in like the late '90s or something when Buchanan wanted to run to sort of like toil with his like running for office.
It sounds like you're referring to the documentary that's on Netflix.
Yes.
But yeah, Roger Stone has a documentary on Netflix that tells this whole story. And like I said, he's an important figure. It's very, very surreal to see him play such a prominent role in today's politics, because when I worked in the Nixon library, we knew him as the guy who just like really harassed Nixon historians on Facebook and Twitter. There's even you can find this online, in 2014 or 15, John Dean, who is the short version of John Dean, he turns against the president, former Nixon advisor, former counselor to the president, who famously turns against Nixon. Okay? And it's his testimony that really is another turning point in the story of Watergate. The Tway House tapes show that John Dean tells the truth basically 95% of the time in his testimony. That's, like I said, a very quick and dirty version of John Dean. So John Dean's an important Watergate figure who a lot of Nixon loyalists think is a turncoat, someone who betrayed the president. And you'll see him on CNN quite a bit comparing Nixon to Trump. Well, when he was promoting his book in 2014 or 15, Roger Stone was in line in the Q&A section. Just months before he becomes this new national figure under the Trump campaign, he's in line harassing John Dean with questions about John Dean's personal life, making jokes. They're making jokes about suing each other. They have a very serious tone. So it's just very, very, I think it says a lot about our current political moment, that this guy who traveled down to Austin so he could just harass John Dean is now a central figure in an investigation into the Trump administration.
John Dean trigger Butterfield opening his mouth
Yes.
on tapes. Is that what happened?
Oh yeah, John Dean's testimony
John
is in June of 1973. Butterfield is in July.
And that's how Butterfield stepped up.
Any other questions? Comments? Okay, well,
Excellent.
thank you so much. I also